loneliness. It's not something people usually consider when talking about Attack on Titan. With such a large and intertwined cast, it seems very few characters would be lonely, but some of them are. Today, I want to talk about Annie and Mikasa. These two are the stars of the Lost Girls OVA, and I think that is a very fitting title for their OVA. Not because they get physically lost, but after their childhoods, I think it's pretty clear where they get lost. Allow me to explain. But first, don't forget to subscribe. I've been having a great time making these YouTube videos, and overall there's definitely an upward trend to this channel. So if you want to get in before I take off and be one of those viewers who found me early, now's your chance. I have a ton of anime content coming on the way, and I don't think you'll want to miss any of it. Anyway, as I was saying, I feel like the traumas of both of their early childhoods is what led them to interact with limited people. They both just lost so much so early into their lives. Annie, for example, was just left behind at birth, abandoned by her parents, before being adopted and forced to train to become a warrior. She was told her entire purpose was to become a warrior and to fight, and it drove her to her breaking point. And even after she accomplished this and became a warrior, she still wasn't really close to any of them. And as far as we can tell, the only two friends she really has throughout the series are probably Armin and Hitch. We can see that from her early childhood to the end of the series, she didn't have many people to rely on. And I don't think she had many people she cared about in general either. We don't know exactly why this happens either. We can kind of speculate whether it was abuse from her father or just how she is. We don't know if it's nature versus nurture, but I feel like it's nurture. We can see that she spends most of her training time in what seems to be deep forest, isolated from the rest of the world, outside of her father. And we also know, based on Zeke's episode, that warrior training in Liberia takes quite a bit of time and is also pretty intense. Between the time she spends training, studying, and traveling between the locations, she probably didn't have much time to socialize, if any at all. Even if she did have time, she might have chosen not to, as spending time alone and isolated was probably more familiar and comfortable to her. With Mikasa, it's a little bit harder to tell. We get glimpses of her life before her kidnapping. She seems like a pretty normal child, excited to talk to her parents, asking about the birds and the bees, the typical children stuff. But then everything changes. She watches both of her parents die, and then she gets kidnapped, and then she kills a guy. It's a pretty stark change to what she was before. And I think part of this is, the Ackerman awakening. But when we look at the other Ackermans, even they're much more emotional and much more connected to those around them than she is. I fully believe that the changes that Mikasa undergoes are partially because of the Ackerman awakening. But I think the other part is undoubtedly just the trauma of watching your parents die when you're like 8 years old. But then after that, she has such a great childhood. And, well, we already know what happens. As if losing your family once wasn't enough, she loses them twice, 2 times. I don't know that we see that much of a change in her personality after the fall of Shiganshina, but I do think there's some slight, subtle changes. These two undoubtedly share some similarities in their backgrounds, mostly early childhood trauma, and a pretty limited group of friends. But I do believe these events affect their actions in some major ways. The biggest one being a lack of independence. Let me explain that. Obviously, they can function on their own. Annie had like that entire solo mission. We've seen Mikasa basically be a squad of her own. But they can't really act without being given direction. We can see this in the manga during the War for Paradis from Mikasa, as well as during the rumbling from Annie. They don't really have that initiative or leadership factor that a ton of other characters have. They're basically great soldiers, but they don't really have the ability to improvise or strategize. And I think Annie is a bit more of a perfect example of this. The female Titans encounter with the Survey Corps is one of the only solo missions in the show. In fact, I think it is the only solo mission. Yeah, she had the aid of pure Titans, but she didn't have any other actual active people helping her. We can see her acting on her own, but I'm 99% sure that she didn't come up with this plan. Based on what we see from the rest of the show, I'm pretty sure that it's Reiner who formulates this plan. And while she does a pretty good job with this plan, completely decimating the Survey Corps, the time when she does have to improvise in the Stohess district, it goes far worse for her. And we can see a similar lack of independence from Mikasa as well. For the majority of the series, her main focus is just saving Eren, and after he activates the rumbling. And once it becomes a lost cause, she doesn't know what to do. We can see this very clearly in her conversation with Armin, and I think it's the most obvious example of her lack of independence. Now I know what you're probably thinking at this point. What does a lack of independence have to do with being lonely? Well, I think this lack of independence comes from their loneliness. Between the early childhood trauma and being forced down a path they didn't choose, they've never had to be independent before, because they never really got the choice to think on their own. As both of them contributed to their respective militaries, they continued to lose more as their already limited friend groups continued to dwindle. The path they were both forced down resulted in even more isolation. By the end of the series, Annie has lost half of the people she could be considered close to, and Mikasa, of course, loses the person she cares most about. Well, loses is a loose term. All in all, I think these two experience an isolated loneliness that not many other characters experience, and I think it has some pretty profound effects on the show. Thank you all for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, don't forget to subscribe and let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thank you again, and I'll see you next week.